All right, we want to just address the basics of filters. So when we're talking about the filter on the synthesizer, we've already talked about that most of the time that when it first started out that it was part of subtractive synthesis, but and it still is. One thing to get in your head is that while you're working with that if your synthesizer doesn't have it on there, you can always throw an EQ on the end of it, an equalizer to help boost, because most of the time the filters on the synthesizers are addressing, cutting out frequency content. So, the filter can also be used to boost frequencies also, just like when you're using an EQ. So let's just take a real quick look at that. All right, so when you're looking at the filter, that basically, for the most part, that you're looking at some degree of an equalization unit. This is a parametric EQ, so you should be fairly familiar with what an EQ does to understand the filter, but we'll address some of that right here. That, basically one of the first parameters is a high cut or a low pass filter, and adjusting, its cutoff, where it's cut off at. And the next thing could be a low cut filter or high pass filter and adjusting its cutoff, where it's cut off at. The next thing might be a band pass, so that you're adjusting the low pass and high pass, the low end and high end cutoff points to band pass some frequency area. And then another example can be, you want to have a band stop area to where you've set your EQ up or your filter up to stop some band. This band in here would be attenuated and cut out of whatever the frequency content is of what you're working on. And the other aspects of it being slopes, with shelf EQs and things like that you should have an understanding of from working with EQs. So, let's take a look at that on the synthesizer. All right, so when you're looking at the filter module on the synthesizer, the first thing that you want to take into consideration is just like when you're looking at the oscillator wavetable, that you've got basically a filter table. So, these you want to look at the description in your synthesizer that gives a good description of this filter and how it's cut off and how the slope is and how exactly it's set up. This here is a low pass 24 decibel ladder filter. So, and this one here is a low pass 24 decibel per octave zero filter. This is a very specific filter, and it's, designed. Its design is different than some filters. So any one of those filters from the filter table here that you want to look in your the paperwork for whatever synthesizer you're working at to get a good description of exactly what it is. But we discussed the basics of what it is, and what the specifics of them might be is debatable or is dependable on whichever synthesizer you're working with. But that's the first aspect of it. So let's take a look at some of the parameters. All right, so some of the key parameters a lot of time, the first biggest key parameter is going to be the cutoff that we've already talked about looking at the EQ there. So we've got a pretty good understanding of what that means, where it's cutting it off at, from which wavetable or which filter you're using from the filter table, depending on where the cutoff is on it. If it's low pass here, then that cutoff's going to be where it breaks. And if it's high pass, that cutoff is going to be where it breaks there. The band pass filter, you're basically going to want to look at where it's set the cutoff on as far as your synthesizer, and have to look at the paperwork to see where that's at. And normally resonance is wherever this breaks and is cut off, that it tries to boost that area a little bit. Right at the cutoff point, that normally means a boost to some degree in that area. So that's the basics on this one. Let's take a look at some others. Okay, one thing to remember whenever you're dealing with the parameters we've talked about so far is they may be, the way they're worded or what they might be doing. The basic parameters of the filter table and the cutoff, the cutoff knob or the resonance things like that, you know, can be very specific to the synthesizer. And sometimes you can actually build the filter, have an actual EQ in it that you can actually set the filter up. Now, the thing to remember about that is that sometimes they'll even follow them in key. That means so that this envelope is going to follow, like if you're playing let's say you're playing an F note on the piano, that, you know, that it's going to base that F note somewhere in this envelope, and this frequency envelope, and when you change notes, this envelope's going to follow it around. Does that make sense? Just like an automated EQ, that setup that you've done, like a low pass filter, it won't stay static, and it'll actually move around as you move around on different notes on the piano. So that's something to look into. But the basics are pretty simple, just like that. And most of the time it's dealing with subtractive EQ. And the basic concept of that is very simple, and try to keep it that simple in your mind. And just like any other module, whenever you start finding other parameters, like on this one, you've got punch, drive, velocity, you know, there can be different things happening on this one here. Let's see, I've got another one sitting up here, and this one, it's got envelope depth and key tracking. That's more likely key tracking. The envelope filter here is being adjusted like that. And, you know, but it's set up a little bit differently as far as what the basics and how it's dealing with those basics. Does that make sense? And if you get into some other type of synthesizers, and we're just looking at a few, like gain here, you know, some of these knobs down here, this one right here that seems to be connected to resonance. Now, anytime you start seeing the stuff that's not addressing those basic things that we're talking about, that, you know, you want to address those parameters just like you do any other module. How's that affecting those basic parameters? What's it doing to that filter? It's doing something else to the filter, or that module might be very unique to that synthesizer. And how is this parameter right here addressing the resonance? What's it doing to it? How's it changing it or doing something like that? And it's got a connection here to go somewhere, right? So where all can that go, and for what purpose? Does that make sense? And, you know, those kind of things, just like any other module you want to research. But the very basic understanding of it is that, you know, most of the time it's a subtractive synthesis method of filtering. And that basic concept is very easy to understand. And the only other thing I really want to address in this video is that, you know, whatever synthesizer you got, and you find the module where the filter is, or it might have multiple filters, to, you know, find those basics that we've talked about. After you find the basics, figure out how they're configured and how they're put together and exactly how they're laid out, so that you have a very clear understanding of exactly what you're looking at when you're looking at those basic parameters. And after you get done with that, to understand what any other parameters might be doing, address any parameter that we haven't talked about, you know, as a unique parameter on that filter. Because, you know, there's a lot of things that can be happening in filters. So, you know, I don't want to go into a whole bunch of different things, because basically after you understand the basic concept of subtractive synthesis and what that filter is trying to do, that, you know, you can basically work from there as far as getting, you know, an understanding of what the rest of the module might be trying to do. But basically, just first of all, understand how it's trying to do those basic things. And like I said, one last thing that I wanted to address is a lot of times on synthesizers, because of using the oscillators and the way that it's set up, a lot of times that they really don't take into consideration reverse filtering, meaning, you know, instead of using that filter to boost, you know, frequency content, you know, like, you know, when you're working in, you know, on a track, that you might sometimes boost some frequency content, you know, and it might be very specific. And, you know, and if you've got, you know, if you've got on your synthesizer and you've, from the wave table, you've got, you know, like a sawtooth wave, that, you know, a lot of times it doesn't give you any way to boost just some of that content. Does that make sense? So you might have to actually do that from an EQ. There's other ways to do that, and we'll talk about that. But that's the basic understanding when you see the filter, what it's trying to address. And, you know, for the most part, most of the time, it's dealing with subtractive synthesis. and then just look at it the way that we've talked about it and the way we've looked at any other module. Find the basic functions, how they're working on that synthesizer, and then systematically address any of the other things that might be happening with that filter, or it might be trying to do differently, or unique things that it might be trying to do. Because like I said, anytime you're dealing with synthesizers, that sometimes people get the ideas in their head that sometimes they're great ideas and sometimes they're not the greatest idea, and sometimes, does that make sense? And and they might get something going on. You find some filter that's got some knobs on it, and you're like, well, what the heck is that doing? And you really need to just get out the paperwork for that synthesizer and find out exactly what that thing is doing. But you understand the basics of it, and then just, research out any other parameters that might be there. So now I hope when you see the synthesizer and you see the filter that you have an understanding of what you're looking at, the basic concept of it, the basic parameters of it, and then, you need to research a little bit on anything that might not be just those basic things we were talking about. So we're on to the next module. Sure hope you enjoyed the video. Peace, hope, love.